A major historiographical question in studies of the French Revolution is whether or not the revolution itself was fundamentally the same in 1789 as it was in 1793. Scholars have long argued both sides of the issue. The circumstances were certainly different. In the summer of 1789, an ancient monarchy imploded in the midst of an economic crisis and widespread popular unrest. In 1793, the king was dead, and a new republic was struggling to find its way in the midst of war and civil war. Scholars like Francois Furet, Keith Michael Baker, Dan Edelstein, and Paul Friedland have claimed that the intellectual climate, the discourse of revolution, was fundamentally the same in 1793-1794 as it had been in 1789: exclusive, intolerant, eliminationist, and violent. Marisa Linton and Timothy Tackett have argued that 1789 and 1793 are quite different. They have tended to locate the motor of radicalization in the revolution in the experience of the revolution itself, most recently in the emotional state of the deputies as they faced well-founded fears of conspiracy and betrayal. Annie Jourdain has argued along these lines that the rhetorical violence of the early revolution only turned into real violence with the war against Austria and Prussia, taking the stand that violent rhetoric led to violent action only when the circumstances in which the deputies' violent words were uttered had changed. In this paper, I propose a kind of natural experiment to see how the specific discourse of classical republicanism, explored by Keith Baker, interacts with notions of conspiracy and emotion. I want to see how the discourse changed the circumstances. I want to see how the discourse changed as the circumstances around it shifted, looking for ways in which circumstances and discourse are interdependent rather than individually determinate. In my larger project, I will examine references to classical Rome in the early revolution between 1789 and 1794, charting the way in which terms and events from antiquity were used. For now, I will look at the specific case of references to the Catiline conspiracy of 63 BCE in Rome, where classical republicanism and fears of conspiracy most fruitfully overlap. According to the ancient historians Plutarch and Sallust, the conspiracy led by Lucius Sergius Catiline posed a truly existential threat to the Roman Republic in 63 BCE. Had he succeeded, the Republic would have ended and its defenders would have perished. Catiline was a senator and former consul who plotted to overthrow the Republic and place himself in charge. He and his fellow plotters planned an uprising and a massacre of their opponents. When one of the sitting consuls, Marcus Tullius Cicero, got wind of the conspiracy, he made 4 speeches in which he urged the Senate and people of Rome to take immediate action to stop the conspirators. Catiline eventually fled the city and died in battle, leading a rebel army against Rome. The story of Catiline's conspiracy and defeat was a feature of the education of elites in the old regime. A search for Catalina in the Archives Parlementaires at the French Revolution Digital Archive, hosted by Stanford University, shows 70 references to Catiline between the opening of the Estates General in May 1789 and the beginning of January 1794, when the digitized portion ends. Of these, 60 references, or 86%, come from 1792 and 1793, with only 4 instances in 1789, 1 in 1790, and 5 in 1791. Despite popular violence and public disorder during the period 1789 to 1791, despite the many references to conspiracies and plots in deputy speeches at the time, the premier conspiracy of antiquity didn't come up regularly until 1792. From occasional mentions in 1789 to 1791, to frequent or even very frequent mentions in 1792 to 1793, the Catiline conspiracy went from being a sideshow to a main feature in debate. References picked up with the move to war and the overthrow of the monarchy in 1792, around the time of Louis XVI's trial, from November to January of 1793, with the largest spike from April to July of that year, as the struggle between the Jacobins and the Girondins took off and the various civil wars began. Finally, another cluster of references appeared in October 1793, when the Girondins went on trial. My long-term goal is to find out what drove changes in both the quantity and quality of how Catiline was used in debate. To that end, we will here examine how Catiline was invoked during the early formative months of the National Assembly in order to give us a baseline against which to compare later references. We will look to see how the references worked in the rhetorical ecosystem at hand. In time, as my project continues, we will be able to see how the ecosystem changed, and hopefully I will be able to make a contribution to the ongoing debate over how and whether circumstances influenced the rhetoric and actions of the deputies in the early revolutionary assemblies. Deputies' use of the Catiline conspiracy varied a bit in 1789, but three key themes stand out. First, the deputies brought up Catiline when there was a perceived existential threat to the National Assembly. Second, they mentioned him when they wished for immediate action to be taken. Third, they invoked him when the deputies were threatened with personal harm. The first mention of Catiline in the National Assembly occurred on the 23rd of June, immediately after Louis XVI had ended a royal session in which he had declared the National Assembly quashed and its actions void. Deputies from the Third Estate refused to leave the hall and met to discuss their options. The Count of Mirabeau, sitting as a representative to the Third Estate from Aix, rallied the deputies to defy the king. He drew their attention to the many soldiers filling the streets of Versailles and asked if Catiline was at the gates of the city, that they needed so many armed men to protect them. This was a brilliant rhetorical move, as he indirectly referred to the belief common among Third Estate deputies that the king's advisors were conspiring against the National Assembly without accusing the king of being part of that conspiracy. Mirabeau used the reference to demand action by the Assembly, much in line with the intent of Cicero's original speeches. Did Mirabeau ask that the conspirators be brought to trial or killed outright? Not at all. He asked that the deputies again swear the tennis court oath, declaring that they would not be intimidated by soldiers or by royal orders into abandoning their mission to write a constitution for France. The next mention of Catiline did not come for more than 2 months. As August came to an end, the deputies turned to discussion of how the powers of government would be organized in the French Constitution. Deputies of the far left wanted the king to have no veto at all over legislation. Deputies of the right wanted a veto that could not be overridden, an absolute veto. In the center, a group of deputies supported a suspensive veto, one that could be overridden by the legislature itself, as in the United States, or through a referendum of some kind. On the night of the 30th of August, vigorous discussion of the veto held in the cafes of the Palais Royal turned into an attempted march on Versailles. The Third Estate deputy Antoine Thibaudot was there. He tells us in his memoirs that activists at the Café de Foix demanded that something be done to prevent reactionaries in the assembly from violating the people's will by giving the king an absolute veto. They worried that the veto could be used on the revolution itself to undo all that had been accomplished. After much debate, an impromptu assembly of activists commissioned the Marquis of Saint-Derouge to lead a delegation to the National Assembly in Versailles that would deliver a petition demanding all the supporters of the absolute veto be purged from the assembly, amounting to about half of the noble and clerical deputies, along with 100 members of the Third Estate. Sources disagree as to how many people actually marched, and in the event, the activists were blocked by the National Guard along their way to Versailles. Speakers in the Palais Royal had claimed 15,000 men were ready to march. Contemporary reports state as many as 6,000 or as few as 50 actually did. Nevertheless, the number 15,000 got reported to the Assembly the next day. Regardless of how many actually marched on the night of the 30th of August, the number 15,000 stuck in the minds of the deputies and informed their discussion. They seemed to agree that the absolute numbers of marchers made a difference in how seriously the event should be taken. When the assembly came to order on the 31st of August, the Count of Lally-Tollendal, a noble deputy for Paris, informed the deputies of what had happened the night before, reading letters he had been given by men who had evaded the guard and reached Versailles. He recounted demands in the petition given to him and the accompanying letters that the assembly be purged of its conservative members, as well as threats to burn the chateau of those who voted for a royal veto. Individual deputies had been named, he said, and their lives threatened. The Count of Clermont-Tonnerre then stood up and asked that something be done to guarantee the safety of the deputies. He did not doubt the courage of the deputies, who he said would gladly die for their country, but he insisted that a constitution could only be written during a period of calm, when the deputies could debate issues freely. He suggested that if Parisian authorities were unable to guarantee their safety, the assembly ought to relocate to a new place further away from the city. After Clermont-Tonnerre spoke, other deputies asked that the assembly not take up his motion and that the body return to the order of the day. Third Estate Deputy Guillaume-François Goupil-Préfin asked that the discussion continue. He said that if they could not discuss a motion to ensure their own safety now, with threats to individual deputies and their property, with news that 15,000 men had hoped to purge the assembly of hundreds of members, when could they? He made his point in as compact a way possible by invoking the Catiline conspiracy. He said that since, quote, Catiline is at the gates of Rome, threatening to slit the throats of senators, unquote, there was no question that it was important to discuss how to keep the deputies safe. The main point to be taken from the Catiline conspiracy, one would think, was not that elected assemblies should keep discussing things when faced with danger. Cicero had wanted the Senate to stop dithering and do something. Perhaps this is why Goupil-Préfin's intervention had little immediate impact. While Clermont-Tonnerre's speech appeared in many contemporary newspapers and in deputy letters and memoir, Goupil-Préfin's only appears in a few. Despite his bloody and violent imagery, Goupil-Préfin's speech did not make a splash. It was not, however, entirely forgotten. The third invocation of Catiline is different from these two examples in that the speaker used Catiline to foreground an existential threat to the revolution without claiming there was a conspiracy or any immediate danger to the assembly itself. It came on the 26th of September, when Mirabeau referred to Goupil-Préfin's speech of the 31st of August while attempting to focus the attention of the assembly on the pressing issue of public finance and its relationship to public disorder. Mirabeau wanted to create a sense of urgency without pushing things to a sense of crisis. He did this by deploring Goupil-Préfin's attempt to pose what Mirabeau called a minor disturbance in the Palais Royal as an existential threat to the assembly. Mirabeau said that as of the 26th of September, there was no conspiracy, no Catiline at the gates, no pressing threat to the safety and autonomy of the assembly. There was, however, an existential threat to the revolution, and that was the threat of bankruptcy. It was not public disorder that would topple the revolution, Mirabeau claimed, but the collapse of public finance. Catiline was used here both as a call to action and as a way to claim that there was no conspiracy to harm the deputies or shut down the National Assembly. The final reference to Catiline came 2 weeks later, shortly after the October days. With it, we return to the themes of the safety of the deputies and the autonomy of the National Assembly. On the 10th of October, Nicolas Robert, Marquis of Cocherel, a noble deputy from Saint-Domingue, recounted a strange story. On the 6th of October, while making his way to Paris ahead of the king's carriage in the aftermath of the March on Versailles by Parisians, Cocherel had been stopped by a group of ordinary people. They recognized Cocherel and his traveling companion as deputies and asked if one of them happened to be the Count of Virieu, a prominent supporter of the absolute veto. Assured that neither of them was, a man from the crowd flourished a piece of paper, saying they were looking for deputies whose names appeared on a list. In particular, this man was hoping to find the Count of Virieu, as he wanted to kill him himself. Cocherel brought this exchange to the assembly and demanded that something be done to ensure the safety of the deputies. He asked, "What? Does there exist among the French another Catiline, who designates here his victims, who wishes an infamous death to those among us who, faithful to our oaths, have the noble firmness to develop our thoughts and speak the language of our hearts?" He worried that the deputies might legislate out of fear and wished for action to be taken immediately to protect their freedom of debate. As had Goupil-Préfin before him, Cocherel used the example of Catiline to argue that conspirators were at the gates of the city, coming to slit the throats of the deputies. He used Catiline to argue that the deputies had to take immediate action, as had Mirabeau on the 26th of September. Cocherel's speech had great impact, a reflection of the dramatically different context in which it was given. On the 31st of August, in the aftermath of the attempted march on Versailles, few deputies had been even indirectly impacted by the events of the previous night. When center-right deputies had spoken of the threat from the people of the Palais Royal, the suggestion that the National Assembly was in danger was literally laughed off the floor. On the 10th of October, all the deputies remembered the terrifying events of the 5th and 6th of October. No one could dispute Cocherel's claim that at least some deputies were in real danger. Cocherel's suggestion that something be done was taken up, and within 2 weeks, the Assembly had passed its law on tumults, a law that gave civic authorities the power to regulate popular assemblies and to disperse them with violence if necessary. The National Guard was to behave in the future as it had on the night of the 30th of August, protecting civic authorities and public order, not as it had on the night of the 5th of October. In 3 of the 4 references to Catiline from speeches given in 1789, we see Catiline deployed as a way to highlight the need for the National Assembly to have freedom to discuss whatever topic it chose without fear of intimidation or violence. The Assembly did not attempt to exclude the vocal conservative minority targeted by activists. Instead, the Assembly took steps to protect it. Far from acting extra-legally to execute plotters in the aftermath of the October days, the deputies allowed the man suspected of being behind the crisis, the Duke of Orleans, to voluntarily go into exile in London and to return again once Paris was calm. In short, despite real threats, the deputies prevented a purge of the Assembly and acted to preserve the ability of a conservative minority to make provocative speeches. Despite the violence around them and their own references to violent events in antiquity, the deputies did not call for violent action. They reacted on the 10th of October as they had on the 23rd of June. Faced with external threats that no deputy could deny, they acted to solidify the existence of the National Assembly through legislative action. Harold Parker long ago argued that the change in frequency of references to antiquity in deputy speeches came from a change in the circumstances in which the deputies gave them. Keith Baker has argued instead that the discourse of classical republicanism drove the changes in circumstances as the discourse transformed. As I continue my qualitative research into how references to antiquity functioned in the debates of the early revolutionary assemblies, I hope to better explain what drove a change in the frequency of these appearances, the explosive combination of pre-existing discourses, or the growing climate of fear and suspicion driven by circumstances largely outside of the deputy's control. Thank you.